Great. So over the next few weeks, we want to give a bit of space to let the stories that Jesus told about grace speak for themselves. And earlier on in the week, I kind of had this fancy intro about how our world is so desperate for grace. And believe me, it was a really good intro, okay? I write the best intros. That was my Donald Trump impression. But I hit delete because let's just get straight into this story again. And it was brilliant having Claudia read the whole passage earlier. Maybe you missed that, hopefully not. And act it out a little bit as well. But we're just going to get stuck straight into it. Every one of Jesus' listeners knew all about vineyards. There are vineyards everywhere in Israel, Palestine. It's a bit like kind of Costa Coffee in Edinburgh. Everywhere you look, there's a vineyard. And you get to this time of year, just before the harvest, where it gets very frantic and frenetic. And you have to harvest all the grapes before rainy season starts. So the vineyard owners need to bus in as many extra workers for a few weeks to get it all before it gets ruined and spoiled, which is a bit like when I worked at Asda in the seasonal aisle before Christmas. They just needed a few extra hands to get the work done. Anybody done a seasonal job? Okay, so yeah, you know exactly. Why is everyone so timid? Everyone's like, there's no shame. You worked at Asda for a few weeks, it's all good. So they needed to bus in. I feel like everyone's just breathing out a little bit now the kids have gone out. It's okay, you're safe in here. Everything's going to be fine. And so the men without work would hang out in the town center and they would hope that they'd get picked up by one of these vineyard owners for a day, for a few days, for a couple of weeks and get some extra income because maybe they don't have a full-time job or their own land that they can work elsewhere. So it's 6 a.m. and you get picked up. Anybody up at 6 a.m. this morning? Well done, you guys. And you shake hands with the vineyard owner, with your right hand probably, on your wages, and then you jump into the bus. There wasn't a bus, but you jump into the bus and you head to the vineyard. All good. A few hours later, it's 9 a.m., and you know, we could do with a few more grape pickers, so you want to come and join, that would be great. We'll sort all the money stuff out later. All good, okay? Same again at noon. It's getting really hot now, though. Really, really hot. And my goodness, it does get hot out there. And then again at 3 p.m. in the searing heat of Israel. More grape pickers, more. And then the final batch of people, they go back into the town one last time at 5 p.m. and find some people who've been there all day. Well, what are you doing here? Well, we've just been here. We've just been waiting. Nobody's picked us up. We're ready to go. Okay. And they probably think, is it worth it for just 1 hour? Is it worth taking Thomas on when there's only 10 days until Christmas? Yeah, we've got a lot of stock we need to sell. Yeah, we've got a lot of grapes that we need to pick. Of course it's worth it. We'll take anything we can get. 1 hour, jump in the minibus. Let's go. Evening time approaches. Time to get paid. And how many of us know that everything's going all good in life until money gets involved and then things just get a bit weird, you know? Whether it's you've lent some money to your friends and you thought it was very clear about what you said, but it turns out it wasn't as clear as you'd hoped. And this is where things get a bit funky. The guys that have just been there for an hour get paid first. Oh, that's going to feel a bit funny, isn't it? They get paid first. Bit of a slap in the face for those who've been there since 6 a.m. And then he kind of works backwards. The vineyard owner works backwards to make sure the guys who've been there 6 a.m. are not paid, are not paid until last. Oh my goodness. I can feel the rage kind of boiling up in some of them. But you know, they might get paid last, but at least they get paid, 2 times, 3 times, maybe 4 times what the guys who came in last get paid, yeah? Right? Right, Dave? No. Wrong, Dave. Okay? Wrong. We've read the story twice now, Dave. That's not what happens. Yeah. So in true Oprah Winfrey style, you get a denarius, everyone gets a denarius. What's going on here? Some of the guys have been out there for 12 hours working in the baking hot sun. Some people have just basically, they're barely there. They barely got their foot through the door, and they get a denarius too. So naturally, the 6 a.m.ers are struggling to get their heads around this. It says in Matthew 20, you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the work and the heat of the day. In other words, this is not fair. So it's a curious story, isn't it? It is a curious story. How does it make you feel if you're part of the 6 a.m. crowd? I know we've done this a bit already, but we're going to do it again. How does it make you feel? You're part of the 6 a.m. crowd. How are you feeling? You're not coming back for a second day, okay? Anybody else? That's the general feeling? Yeah, Eurus? yeah. You're busy until 5 the next day. Okay, yeah, I see. Very clever, Eurus. Very clever. Okay, you're part of the 5 p.m. crowd. How are you feeling? Surprised? Happy? Anyone else? I was going to say embarrassed. Yeah, you might feel a bit sheepish, or maybe not. I don't know. Everyone's different, aren't they? Happy, surprised, embarrassed. Anything else? Okay, if you're the boss, if you're the vineyard owner, would you have done the same, or would you have done things differently? Turn to the person beside you and tell them, what would you have done if you were the vineyard owner? Or have a think to yourself. Okay. Guys, this is church, okay? Can we stop talking, okay? Stop chatting through. So, one of the most famous football photos from the last few years is this one. It's a picture of a man called John Terry wearing his full kit. And you might think there's nothing unordinary about this photo, but actually John Terry was suspended in the semi-final after he got a red card, and so he wasn't allowed to play in the Champions League final. But after his team won the final, Chelsea won the final in the Champions League, he then proceeded to dress up not only in his full shirt, but also his shorts and his socks and his shin pads as well, even though he hadn't played a minute of the game. And so he collected the trophy and stood up there and held the trophy aloft as if he'd been playing the whole time, as if history would forget. But history never forgets, does it? And actually, this photo has gone on to be a meme, and one of these photos that people talk about, everyone just is kind of laughing at him because they think, how pathetic. You didn't even play a minute of the game, and here you come in swanning in as though, you were the star player, as if you'd scored a hat trick. We know what really happened. Okay, here's the question. What if one of the most ridiculed images in popular football culture was actually a really accurate picture of how the kingdom of heaven looks? What if one of the most ridiculed images in the football world, and I know some of you love football, some of you hate it, is actually a very good picture of how the kingdom of heaven looks? The 5 p.m. worker got full pay and was allowed to put his shirt and his shorts and his shin pads on and appear in the team photo at the end of the day. Let's think for a second about those who heard this story the first time it was told 2,000 years ago. I think their minds would have immediately gone to the history of Israel. You can almost kind of hear them saying through the passage, well, yeah, you can trace our history all the way back to Abraham. We were slaves in Egypt for 400 years. We've endured exile. We've endured sieges and famines. We've built temples with our own hands, and then we've seen them destroyed, and then we built them back again. And Jesus, you are hinting, you are telling us that other people can inherit God's promises and God's kingdom and all of that it entails, just like that. Well, where have they been the last 2,000 years? Where have they been the last 3,000 years? Where have been the whole of the history of God's people? They haven't known our struggle. They haven't put in our work. They don't even know who you are. How could they even possibly know who you are, God? These people, them, those who've hardly borne the burden of the work in the heat of the day. Not fair. And this is definitely about the Israelites and the Gentiles, the non-Jews. But this is also about me, and this is about you, and this is about us. Because ultimately, this is about our hearts. And Jesus always gets to the heart of the matter, which is the matter of our hearts. That's what Jesus really cares about. And so in light of the cross, we believe as Christians that every sinner is welcome in the kingdom of heaven. That is one of the backbones of our beliefs as Christians. But still, this is a hard teaching for us. What, like, even them? Even they are allowed into the kingdom of heaven? What, Jesus would even eat with them at their house? But surely you don't know what they're really like, because I've seen some stuff that you probably haven't seen, and I really know what they're like. And I've read the article about what they did, and I've spoken to such and such who's told me such and such, and they've told me what they did, and surely not them. And these questions and these things that we say and things that we think are at the very heart of the matter of grace. And I think it's important that we address them and we bring them out into the light. Because this invitation to grace is for everyone. And I said it last week, I'll say it next week. It doesn't matter what you've done, how well you've lived, how badly you've lived, the things that mark your past. Grace and the invitation to it is for everybody. And we find that jarring, But I've been up since 6 a.m. I am covered in salt and sweat, and I've got a searing headache, But I've never even sworn in public. I always pay my taxes. Grace can be upsetting for those who feel like we've earned it, to those who feel like we somehow deserve it. And on a human level, we all want to see our hard work rewarded. Who wants to see their hard work rewarded? When you work hard, you want to see it rewarded. Anybody remember that feeling when you were on a school project and you had a few meetings that you had to schedule, you had a project that you needed to deliver, and there were a couple of you that worked really hard, you stayed late up night, you got all the work done, and there was some wee guy who looked probably quite like me, who didn't turn up to any of the meetings, didn't reply to any of the emails, and you all got the same grade at the end of the day. And it felt either infuriating or it felt amazing. Or maybe you felt a bit sheepish or a bit embarrassed, or maybe you were surprised. I didn't know, because grace affects us all differently, doesn't it? From nursery school onwards, we are taught to succeed in the world of ungrace, a world without grace, which says the early bird gets the worm, no pain, no gain, no such thing as a free lunch, demand your rights, get what you pay for. But this story that Jesus tells us does not abide by these rules that the world tells us. The world tells us that that's gospel, doesn't it? And Jesus speaks a different word, a word of grace, a gospel of grace. And I praise God that he doesn't live by the standards that the world has set. And ultimately, the question that this passage asks of each one of us is, where do you want to make your home? In a world that's full of grace or a world without grace? Two of the founders of Alcoholics Anonymous went to visit a man in hospital. This is probably close to 100 years ago. And he was strapped to a hospital bed after attacking two of the hospital staff. His addiction had got out of control and he wasn't in a position where he could manage it. And so he was strapped there and he had to listen to the story that they shared with him. And they shared their story of coming out of addiction with him and the recent hope that they'd discovered and the faith that they'd found in God. And as soon as these two men mentioned God to this man, the patient said, no, don't talk to me about God. It's too late for me. It's too late for me. He said, I still believe in God, but I know that he doesn't believe in me anymore. And this is what is at stake, isn't it? If grace is going to flow, then people's lives are going to be transformed. And people like that man and you and I are going to know that in our worst moment, in our deepest despair, that God hasn't given up on us. And that is not a truth that I want to lose. Grace says it's never too late. It's never too late. And that can feel amazing for the person that receives it, and it can feel uncomfortable for those around them. One of the key themes of the Vineyard story is that grace is ultimately God's call. Verse 15, the vineyard owner says to them, hey, he doesn't say, this isn't in the text, but kind of, hang on a second. Don't I have the right to do what I want to do with my own money? Or are you envious because I am generous? And I read these words quite a few times this week, and basically every time I've been like, whoa, okay. When I don't have grace for those around me, is it actually because I'm envious of the generosity of God's heart? Because I don't carry it every single day that I live. This is really deep. And so often, if we're honest, we want to be the ones who decide where grace goes, who gets grace, who gets a denarius, and how it's all portioned out. I think a lot of us like the idea of grace. Maybe you like the sound of the word, or you like singing the songs about grace, as long as it's given out to the right sort of people. Often people who look like us, who talk like us, who work hard like us, who we woke up at 6 a.m. together with, and we've looked them in the eyes and said, yeah, you deserve grace just like me, because you were there when it all started. But do you know what? Newsflash, at almost 12 o'clock on a Sunday morning in Stenhouse, that's not grace. And that's not God's grace. It's not even close. It's not even close. When we just think, when we think grace is ours to portion out to other people, that's just something that we've made up. It's not God's grace. When we just give it to people and sort of allow for it for people who look like us, or we feel like deserve it, that is not God's grace. That is just the spirit of the age, sort of dressed up in lipstick and with a hat on top, with the word grace stapled on its face. But it's not actually God's heart, because God's grace is so much bigger and wider and deeper and more vast and so much better than anything we could ever come up with on a human level. So I thank God that he makes the big calls and not me. Or even you. And I know most of you, and you're all very nice. But even as nice as you are, I am grateful that none of you have come up with the concept and deliver and portion out, who gets grace. Because on my best days, and maybe you can relate, maybe not, I can be quite graceful and gracious. I think graceful is more about dancing. I'm not a graceful dancer, but I can be quite gracious. And I can be forgiving and I can be kind. But on my worst days, I want revenge. And I hold grudges. And I want people to maybe sample a bit of their own medicine sometimes. Or when they get that, I'm not too unhappy on my worst days. And ultimately, I need grace. Because I'm still healing. And I cannot be trusted to be in charge of grace. And as much as I love you all, neither can any of you. And of course, we still need a place for God's justice. That's so important. And of course, we need to set boundaries with people, and we need to apologize and repent. It's so important. But a world without the grace of God is a harsh, cruel, unforgiving place, I think. And if our lives are not shaped and molded and formed and fashioned by the grace of God, the amazing, lavish grace of God, then our lives will be harsh, cruel, unforgiving. And I don't want that for me, and I certainly don't want that for you. So let's get grace together. You have made them equal to us who've borne the burden of the work and the heat of the day. And the vineyard owner says, I am not being unfair to you. Instead, I am being graceful and gracious to all of you. You know, Jesus never spoke the word grace, at least not recorded in Scripture. Yet, everything about Jesus' teaching and his life and his death speaks a powerful word of grace to a world that I think is obsessed with violence and revenge and our own versions of what justice look like. And we so need this word of grace. In the epistles, which these letters written in the New Testament, somebody called Paul unpacks grace in amazing ways. We're going to have a look at some of the ways that he does that later on in the next few weeks. That sounds amazing. Paul unpacks grace, and it's kind of often, not exclusively, but often a sort of more vertical grace. It's about how God has saved you. It's about God has rescued you, about how God's mercy has touched your life, and he's pulled you out from this place and made a way for you to spend eternity in God's presence, which is amazing. Ephesians, it's by grace that you've been saved. Romans, while we were still sinners and in our worst moment, that's the moment when Christ died for us. And that's incredible. It's a vital side of grace for us to get and receive. But, and this, I think, is at the crux of so much of Jesus' teaching on grace. If grace offered to you doesn't extend beyond you, you haven't got grace at all. You've missed it. You've got a sort of distorted grace that affects you only, but not those around you. Maybe you've got mercy. Maybe you kind of feel, oh, well, God's grace means that I'm off the hook for the things that I've done. But when God's grace truly gets a hold of us, it permeates and fills every single aspect of our thinking, our living, our speaking, our spending. As Jesus would say, a little bit of yeast affects the whole batch of the dough. And I'm just going to hope that some of you know kind of what that means in real terms, because I've never baked a loaf of bread in my life. But the way that we saw the world before we got grace, we look back and think, oh, wow, that feels a long way from home now. What God's done in me has not just saved me from what was coming, from eternal separation from him, but he's changed the way that I see my friends, my family, those that have hurt me. The way we saw the world before becomes alien, becomes unrecognizable, because grace transforms us and changes the way that we perceive everything. If it's grace for me, it has to be grace for everybody around me. It has to extend beyond. You know, there's no such thing as a sort of bottleneck with grace. It can't just come and get stuck, okay, because you can't hog grace to yourself. You can't hoard grace in your attic or your loft. You know, it has to be shared. By definition, grace is something that has to flow through us and beyond us. If you don't give grace away, I think we risk missing grace completely. And so Jesus tells these stories. We're going to look at a bunch of different stories over the next few weeks that cut to the core. And a lot of the heart of it is when we withhold grace from others, we end up withholding ourselves from God, who loves us. And I don't want that for me, and I don't want that for you. I want this church to be drenched in grace. Actual grace. Grace that Paul talks about and enlightens our eyes to. Grace that Jesus unpacks and shows us how it's hard and it's costly, but it will change everything. Grace that means so much that God decided to lay his own life down on the cross in the most extravagant act of grace that the world could ever imagine. I was thinking, the world couldn't have even come up with this in its imagination, yet we witnessed it as the world. Jesus hanging there on a cross saying, Father, forgive them because they don't know what they do. Jesus hanging there on a cross saying, it's finished. Jesus hanging there on a cross saying, today you'll be with me in paradise. And to people that haven't received grace, grace can seem soft. Grace can seem unfair. Grace can even seem revolting. Grace looks unjust. Grace tastes disgusting. Grace looks weak. To the 6 a.m. workers, the vineyard owner might have even seemed corrupt. Or maybe they thought he was just a people pleaser who just wanted to keep everyone happy. Or just a bit pathetic, afraid of making the hard decisions. If we don't receive grace in its fullness, which is a Holy Spirit thing, not just a mind thing, it's a heart thing. All of these stories, all of the things that Jesus taught and lived and shared can look very strange and can look like some of these things. Yet, and this is the beauty of the gospel, and I'll finish on this amazing truth, yet God was willing to seem all of these things to come and reach us. To come and reach us sinners, to rescue the broken. God was willing to look weak. He was coming to seem unfair. Grace risks being despised by the world like Jesus was. He was the cornerstone, but he was rejected by the world. So that one person, think about that guy in the hospital bed who needed to hear that God isn't finished with you yet. And Jesus broke that sort of cycle of ungrace on the cross and said, all of that is finished now. And I'm going to show you a new way, a better way, the way of love. And so for those who receive it, grace is everything. And it's beautiful. And we cherish it and we hold it in our hearts. And we'll be like those who found this precious pearl. And when we discovered it, we sold everything we had because it's, wow, oh my goodness, does Jesus love me so much that he would lay down his life? That he would come to earth, that he would live this way. It has power to save, and I need grace every day. And so Jesus says that the last will be first, and the first will be last. And which world are you going to choose to have your feet planted in? Is it going to be the world of just desserts and the world of ungrace that often looks at grace and thinks, what is going on there? That is strange. Or are you going to plant your feet inside the overwhelming love of God?